Good morning everyone and welcome to another of the Teaching Academy's PD series. As we move into week 3 of the teaching session, today we have the last of the Supervised Assessment series for the current program. And we have Elise Hogg, joined by Mark Sanderlands from DLT, and they are running a session on preparing your students for Supervised Assessment. And as mentioned, this will be the last of the Supervised Assessment series that's currently planned. Who knows what the future may bring, but at this stage, that will be the final one for the 60 series. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Elise, keeping in mind that the session is being recorded and all of the artefacts associated with the session will be available to you shortly after we wrap up. Take it away, Elise.
Thanks so much, Lachlan. Yeah, thanks for that question in the chat, Suzanne. That's absolutely fine. It will be recorded, as Lachlan mentioned, so you'll have full access to that recording. Can I just confirm that everyone can see my slides being shared? Fantastic. All right. Oops, sorry. So welcome everyone to this professional development session, preparing your students for supervised assessment. I'm Elise Hogg. I'm in the role of lead advisor of curriculum development within the Division of Learning and Teaching. Today I'm joined by one of DLT's wonderful educational designers. Actually, there are many of them here today, but Mark was really instrumental in putting this session together. So I just wanted to thank Mark for his valuable and thoughtful feedback and ongoing support to the development of today's session. Mark has kindly agreed to keep an eye on the chat today, so he will be supporting you with any questions that you might like to ask, or if there's anything that you'd like to share, please do feel free to do so. You're more than welcome to pop something into the chat, or you can come off mic, just use that hand raise feature and we can basically see that you've got something to say and I'll throw to you. And before we do get started, just a friendly reminder that you can always catch up on previous session recordings, or you can register to attend our upcoming sessions via the Teaching Academy. All right, first, before we jump into today's session, I'd like to acknowledge country. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the many lands on which we live and work together. I pay my respects to elders within First Nations communities and acknowledge the continuity of cultures, languages, leadership and knowledge systems. I acknowledge First Nations people's continuous connection to country, recognising the unique diverse identities and cultures of people in our communities, regions and nations. I'm speaking to you from the beautiful lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung on Jundate country in West Central Victoria, and I invite you to take a moment to recognise the traditional owners of the country you're joining from today. Okay, so today's session is really building upon a session that we delivered a couple of weeks ago, which explored designing learning activities and resources to support student readiness for supervised assessment. However, if you weren't in attendance at that session or you haven't had a chance to watch the recording, don't worry. This session is designed to be complementary but standalone. So in that previous session, we really focused on approaches that help students to get ready for supervised assessment, using resources and approaches including Meet the Marker cards, student frequently asked questions, assessment exemplars, practice opportunities and preparation checklists. In today's session, we're going to dive a little deeper into exploring how we support our students to understand and recognise what a quality response might look like and sound like in a supervised assessment context. Okay, so we are a small group today, but hopefully we've got enough to get a bit of a chat going. I'd like today's session to be sort of conversational if it can be. So the first thing that we've got for you today is just a quick practice share, just a little Mentimeter question for you to respond to. So I'll pop it into the chat if it hasn't already been popped in there. Oops, sorry, that's the wrong thing. There we go. Oh, Mark's already done it. Thank you so much, Mark. Greatly appreciated. I'll pull up the Menti so that we can see it in live action. There we go. Okay. So basically, we're just having a moment to reflect on our current practice and our experience working closely with our students. One of the most important ways that we help students understand what we're looking for and what quality looks like in any given assignment is, of course, our rubrics. When they're designed well and used well, a rubric isn't just an evaluative tool, something that we use to mark against at the end. It's also formative, something that our students can use along the way to understand the task, determine what quality looks like, and work out how to get there. The same document that helps us judge the work can help our students to produce it. However, interpreting and decoding a rubric, as I'm sure many of you know from experience, let alone deeply engaging with them as a formative tool for learning, doesn't necessarily come naturally to most of our students. It's a skill, and like any skill, it has to be learned and practiced. So during today's session, we're going to explore some approaches to help our students to better understand and then actively use rubrics to support their learning. But before we do, again, I really just want to take a moment to reflect on our learners and just to sort of get a bit of a feel for what's going on in your own context and your own practice. So as we can see here, we've got 6 responses, which is fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone who's contributed. And the main issue that seems to be coming up for our students when it comes to interpreting rubrics is understanding what's being asked and how it connects to the task. So it's really great that we've got 0 who are saying that they don't think that their students are engaging with rubrics at all. And it's interesting that the standards, so telling the difference between grade levels and that academic and disciplinary terminology is actually not the sort of sticking point. Rather, it's what's being asked, how it connects to the task. So those criteria in particular. If there's another area of rubric practice that isn't identified here, feel free to pop it into the chat. Or feel free to come onto mic and share. Lachlan, thank you.
Yeah, look. There we go. How sorry. I was going to say, I suppose somewhere between the first and the second requirement here, I feel like there's a bit of crossover essentially, and that what I'm hoping is that the rubric can sort of be seen as kind of a hack in terms of being able to not only understand the task, but being able to perform not just adequately, but well in the task. So it's not just necessarily about the distinction between the grade levels or necessarily what the task is requesting, but somewhere between the two. So I suppose if there was a fusion somewhere in there, I would have probably settled in that space, but I drifted more towards the first than the second.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think as well, if you don't have a good understanding of the criteria of what's actually being asked of you in the task, it's going to be very difficult in turn to be able to differentiate between the standards and how you might actually hit those different marks. So I think they all do kind of depend upon each other in some way. There's a bit of synergy going on there. All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. It's really interesting. Back into my slides. Okay, so I've had a bit of a look at some of the literature around students' understanding of rubrics, and it's super interesting. If there is one thing that you take away from today's session, I hope it's that interpreting and using a rubric to support learning and assessment preparation is a learned skill. So it's one we ourselves have probably spent a lot of time developing over the course of our time in education. I know that for me particularly, rubrics did not come naturally when I was a student. I found them very difficult to interpret, to understand, and to kind of hold up my own work against and kind of be able to see that sort of see how I'd hit the mark or how I hadn't hit the mark. I think for many of our students, they're probably experiencing a similar sort of issue. Particularly for those who are transitioning to university from a previous context where they may not have had a lot of experience with rubrics. So if our students are really struggling to decode, understand and apply rubrics to their learning, the good thing is they're not alone. A 2016 action research study of our own Charles Sturt students, so this was from Emma Colvin and colleagues, found that 71% said that they always read the rubric, but only 41% said they usually understood what it was actually asking. So while they're reading it and trying to apply it to their learning, whether formatively or summatively, the understanding often just isn't there. I really like this quote from Andrade, who notes, at their very best, rubrics are teaching tools that support student learning and the development of sophisticated thinking skills. However, I think any one of us who sort of worked with rubrics and worked with students knows that it is a little bit more complicated than that. The literature identifies the language commonly used in rubrics as a key stumbling block for students. Terms like critically analyse, synthesise and evaluate are frequently difficult to interpret and need explicit explanation. Without understanding the terminology, research finds that rubrics have very little value for student preparation. Our students therefore require both directed instruction and opportunities to practice, discuss and interpret in order to use rubrics effectively in their learning. And I thought it was some good news that the research suggests that student learning can be improved significantly when students are given structured opportunities to engage actively with assessment criteria and standards through discussion, comparison and practice, and that this improvement may actually last over time and be transferable across learning contexts and other areas. When our students were surveyed for the Colvin paper, they were asked to identify strategies that would improve their assessment experience. And you can see the answers in the little box up the top of the slide. I do apologise for the visual nightmare of this slide. There was quite a lot going on that I really wanted to share with you, so it's a bit of a mess. The rest are a little less assaulting on the eyeballs, I promise. The approaches that our students perceive to have the most value include providing more class time discussing rubrics and assessments, ensuring rubric language is clear, and seeing examples of assessments at different grades. So again, that exemplar piece is really coming in there. And again, this is really great because it actually lines up pretty well with what the literature says about approaches and activities that are actually effective and contribute positively to student learning and understanding in the context of assessment and rubrics. Consistently, the literature points to the same things that the students in the Colvin study were asking for: dedicated time to unpack and discuss the rubric with their teacher and peers, plainer, more understandable language in rubrics, and exemplars that show what different standards look like. So I just wanted to throw to you in the room, does any of this on this slide resonate with your own experiences and what you've seen in your own students? Feel free to pop into the chat. Oh, great, we've already got some posts. Fantastic. Mark says, I like the term of the rubric being a bit of a hack for the students. I often told students to read the HD descriptor and aim for that. Love that. Hayley says that when she was a student, the rubric wasn't discussed at all. That was absolutely my experience. It was kind of, here's the rubric, good luck, off you go. This can be really useful, but also we're not going to show you how to use it. Yeah, I would love to hear from Emma about this piece of research. It's, I think, when did I say, when's it from? 2016. I wonder if she's done any sort of follow-up research since. I wasn't able to find anything additionally, but there was another paper that she had been working with. Kelly says that she used rubric. She used to provide links to the Bloom style command terms such as identify, explain, analyze, etc. in the task description. I love that. That's such a great way to help students to really pull apart and understand exactly what those different verbs are asking for. Hayley says that when she was at uni, she had no rubrics. That's why. Oh, no, sorry, that's Callie. It's a reply. No rubrics at all. That's fascinating. I think in my first year, there was no rubrics. And then it was like they sort of dumped them on us in second year. And again, no real support. So I've been quite adrift. Yeah, Lachlan.
I was just going to say, from a, I suppose, a more pragmatic technical side of things, sort of part of the discussion that we often end up having with academics is about whether or not the rubric in Brightspace, for example, is made visible to students, and when and if sort of thing it's made visible in terms of tying it to assignment portals. So whilst it's a tool for marking in that sense, at that point, there is a real question about the when and the how, as opposed to the subject outline, for example, where obviously is the first instance that the students get it is there. There are often distinctions between what's in the subject outline just because of the mechanical setup of the rubrics and what actually ends up in the Brightspace rubric tool. And the other part is that when you do make it visible from the get-go in the assignment portals, it adds a whole lot of extra scrolling and things to the submission process before a student is able to submit their assignment. So there's no guarantee that that means that students opening that and reading through it, because they're only going into the portal usually when they're ready to submit the task. So at that point, there's very little value, I would argue, at providing the rubric then. But that doesn't really kind of answer that question of how do you get the students to engage with the rubric. You're basically assuming that they've taken the opportunity to genuinely engage with the subject outline, or that the academic potentially is going to take time to unpack that, which I think is some of the stuff that's captured in that table.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the academic taking the time to really walk the students through it, to give them opportunities to have discussions, to ask questions, to, pull things apart, make mistakes, put them back together with the support of the academic is really critical, and the literature really supports that. We will talk about this a little bit later, but basically there is a real critical need for that dialogic piece in supporting students to understand what is expected of them in their assessments, and particularly in their rubrics as well. Sorry, I don't think Suzanne says, I don't think a rubric can be added after any student makes a submission in Brightspace. Lachlan says, sure can be modified. Okay, cool. Thanks, Lachlan, for helping us out with that. And yeah, it's really interesting to hear, not only, I suppose, for those of us who are working with students, what we notice in our students, but also our own personal experiences of having sort of dealt with rubrics in the past as students ourselves. Mark.
Yeah, Elise, I was just going to make the point that we spend a lot of time, rightfully so, teaching content, but I think it's also important to spend a little bit of time demystifying things like the rubric. And it's a bit like, the point that Lachlan made, how do we get them to appreciate its importance? I think we need to point to it and not just have it sitting in the background with our assumption, students should read this. So I think it's sometimes those little points of time that we take to, hey, by the way, guys, look at the rubric, read the rubric. This is important. This is how you interpret it. And even if possible, I know time is always of the essence, but even if possible in class, to take them through it a bit and to explain those terms to support them. So, yeah, just it's a small point, but I think it's important.
I agree. It's absolutely critical. And I think I like that approach as well of encouraging the students to spend some time independently working through the rubric. Again, they can make notes, they can annotate it, they can write down questions that they have. And then you don't have to spend a huge amount of time in class, because we know that teachers have a lot of content and activities and assessment prep to get through. So academic skills can sometimes fall a little bit to the wayside, but you don't need to spend, an hour on this. You can make it short, concise, and still effective. Callie, you had your hand up, but it's down again. I just wanted to check. Did you still want to jump in?
Yeah, Mark stole my thunder. Thanks, Mark. No, great minds think alike. Mark, I was just going to say the same sentiment about the importance of kind of making sure students are aware of that. But I think a lot of times we feel like the job is to focus on the content and delivering the content, and we assume that they have those skills to understand and interpret marking criteria and rubrics and how they inform their grade. But it's not always the case, particularly obviously in first and second year subjects. There's probably more need for that.
Agreed. And explicitly helping them to understand that it can be a formative tool as well as a summative tool. I don't think that was something that I really realized until I was potentially out of my undergrad, that it could be used as something to support me as I was kind of working on my assessment, rather than waiting until the very end of it and getting the rubric back with my teacher's marks. So having the spending the time to just help students to understand that it does have this dual sort of purpose, I think is really helpful as well. Kelly.
Yeah, just one last little point. I quite often used to give students like sample papers, like mock papers, and the marking criteria, and get them to mark in groups or in pairs. But again, it's different when you're teaching kind of a first year comp subject where you're trying to help them build those like executive functioning skills and kind of those academic skills. Most lecturers and academics don't have the time because, again, they're too busy trying to cover the content. So it's, again, one of those wicked problems, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act. And yeah, I love the term wicked problem. We deal with so many of them in higher ed. Thank you so much, everyone. That's really interesting to hear your sort of experiences and some of those strategies as well that you've already been designing. So I know we've got a lot of educational designers in the room today, and a couple of academics. So what I'd like to do now is just get you to select a rubric from your subject and just turn the lens on ourselves for a moment. Grab a rubric. It can be one that you've marked with previously, one that you'll be marking with in the future. Just pull it up again. You don't need to sort of go into any great depth or detail, but just have a quick peruse of it. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And just have a think about, can you interpret it yourself? Could you explain to a student what is different between a HD and a pass according to the rubric? Sorry, HD and a D, or a credit and a pass. Is the wording clear enough to show what actually differentiates one standard from the next? And if a student asked you, are you confident that you could explain it? This is basically an opportunity for me to give a bit of a shout out to our educational design team, because if you do find yourself struggling, it's probably a sign that your students will also struggle with the rubric, and it might be an opportunity to consider a review before the next session. So again, great place for me to give a plug to our great educational design team, as rubric review and design is exactly the sort of thing that they're more than equipped to support academics with. They're experts in this area, as you can hear just by some of the conversation going on in the space today, and they have a wealth of expertise. So if you are looking to enhance or improve your rubric for the next session, you can connect with our educational designers by logging a job via Sherwell. And we do have a slide at the very end of the session with the link so that you can easily reach out as well. Okay, so if you've had a quick look at your rubric, I just want to have a think about how you might go about helping your students to decode it. Maybe you're going to unpack the language with them. Maybe you're going to show a stronger and a weaker attempt side by side. Maybe you get them to put a criterion into their own words. And depending on whether you teach online or on campus, the way that you go about facilitating such an activity might be a little bit different. So how might you go about actually ensuring that the students have the opportunity to engage in this particular activity? So again, we'll just have a moment, just have another little chat. Is there something that you're already doing to help your students to understand and use the rubric as a tool to support their assessment preparation? So again, we're really thinking here about that formative positioning of the rubric to help the students understand what is expected of them and what quality looks like in that preparation sort of lead into the supervised assessment task. Fantastic, we've got some posts in here already. Adverbial soup, I love that, Lachlan. Confidently and succinctly articulates into a topic here, absolutely, Callie. So those sort of, I guess, standards or criterion where it can be quite difficult to actually get a sort of, I guess, a material understanding of what exactly is being expected of the student across the different standards or within the criterion itself. See, we've got some comments being typed, so I'll just wait for those to come through. Liz says an increased focus on us on using plain English without losing the intention of the text would be a good thing, I think. Beautiful. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Liz. I think that's a really great way to describe it. Yeah, Hayley, outstanding, excellent sound and good. How do we actually help our students to understand what that actually means? And can we, are these actually observable qualities? Confidently misunderstands the whole point, says Lachlan. Danielle says, edit the deficit language and focus on what we want them to achieve or show. Beautiful, fantastic, love that. And you're getting lots of love there on that one as well. All right, great. So I'll move on to the next slide. And we're going to have a look at some strategies that we can use to support our students. So basically just taking a moment to dive a little bit deeper into some of these support strategies that we've just had a bit of a chat about. Okay.
Just so before you move on, Elise, I was going to say,
Mark, sorry.
Kelly had her hand up there. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm so sorry, Kelly. I completely missed that.
No, that's okay. It's not anything particularly groundbreaking. I'm going to just throw a spanner into the works before you move on to the slide, and it might dovetail with what you want to talk about. But I think as a teacher and probably as EDs, we've had that debate around, do you attach like a number of a specific thing that you're looking for in a rubric, right? So if it's referencing, uses at least 6 references, uses at least 8 references, 10 references, because again, based on experience, that creates kind of another ripple or potential impact, because a student can say to you, but I use 6, right? Yeah, or whatever the number is. Suited. But it's about the quality and are they integrated? And again, I used to say to students, you can't just like take your pepper shaker and throw your quotes in at the end, right? Where they're not contextualized, blah, blah, blah. But they'd come to you and they'd say, but I have 4 or 6 or 8 or whatever the number is. So there's kind of, and I think whenever we kind of attach that numeric value to things, and again, there's lots of kind of debate around yes and no, and probably good arguments to be made in both instances. But I think for us, we need to think through what are the potential pros and cons of that before we we use that as a strategy to try, like, in one way it helps to demystify that for students, because they say, oh, okay, well, I know now that I need X number of whatever it might be, but there's a trade-off as well. So I think
Absolutely.
there's probably lots of conversation we could have around that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're making me think of the solo taxonomy, where at the sort of lower order of thinking, you've kind of got, oh gosh, I always go blank on what it's called, but you've got, like, sort of one component or like multiple components. And then when you kind of get the students moving into that higher order thinking, that's where they're able to identify relationships and connections. And that's where the real thinking is happening, rather than that qualitative kind of piece. So kind of moving the students from that qualitative, I guess, thinking and, as you said, kind of just trying to fill in, one or two, I'm ticking them off, into that sort of relational and analytical sort of space. Absolutely. Danielle says using scaffolding with a range and qualifiers, e.g. peer reviewed or from last 5 years. Yeah, exactly. So really being able to explain exactly what it is that we're looking for. And it's most often not sort of just the number of references, it's the suitability and the quality, whether they were appropriate for the assessment. No Reddit. Okay, cool. Let's jump back into it. Yeah, so often a simple approach can be really effective. And if we think back to the Colvin research, it is also an approach that our students really value. So it can be as simple as just talking about the rubric with your learners, setting aside some time for an open discussion where you work through the rubric's purpose, its criteria, its standards, and of course, any discipline-specific or academic language, so students can see for themselves what is actually separating one standard from the next. You work together to negotiate meaning and to make the tacit standards explicit. This simple activity takes very little time to plan, reduces ambiguity and uncertainty, supports students to delineate between grades and standards, and identify the elements that contribute to variations in performance. It also allows you to position the rubric early as a formative learning tool and supports your students to cultivate reflective and critical practice with rubrics by supporting the development of engaged, self-regulated learners who are capable of applying their knowledge and skills to new tasks. So how might you go about supporting such an approach? Callie, I think it was, mentioned Bloom's taxonomy a little bit earlier, and using Bloom's to really pull apart what the verbs are actually asking for and what they mean. So you might consider using Bloom's taxonomy. The verbs in our rubrics, of course, often seem really clear and well chosen to us, but that doesn't necessarily translate across to our students, as we've been kind of discussing here today. So obviously, analyze is asking our students to do something quite different, to evaluate, but finding the difference between what is actually being asked for here and what these different terms mean can often be really challenging for our students who don't necessarily pick up on that difference. And if we're not making it explicit in our teaching, that can be a real challenge for our students. So if you look across the table, you can see the what it means column unpacks the thinking behind each verb, and the what you'll do column turns that into what a student actually does. So for analyze, we're asking students to break ideas into parts and examine structures, connections, and relationships. And the doing is something like pulling apart a case or an argument to show those relationships. So the first column is really helping you to say what the verb is looking for. And the second helps you to describe what a good response to it would look like in concrete terms that a student can act on. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend handing this table to your students. It's probably going to be quite overwhelming for them. More, I think this is useful for us as a tool for us as educators. So it helps us to think about what we're actually asking for and how we can explain it clearly to our students. So you can use something like this to sharpen your own thinking about what a verb is really demanding. And then you can use an approach like this to help put it into language that your students will understand. So it might just support you a little bit with sort of planning for that particular activity. Thanks, Mark. And Lachlan says that his full room looks a little bit different. I saw there was an article in The Guardian today about the castle, actually. I wonder what's going on there. So yeah, I would just love to hear, have any of you used Bloom's or another taxonomy, perhaps solo, to help your students to sort of understand what is being expected and asked of them, and particularly what the verbs are really looking for? Thanks, Michelle. The house has been sold. Oh no. Leanne says the castle stage play coming soon. They're making the castle into a musical. I don't know who's telling the truth. We've got 2 people saying stage play though, so maybe it's both. All right. Yeah, great. So again, I don't think this is something that you would hand to your students, but I think it is something that can really help you to differentiate between the different verbs that we use and to help, I guess, position and frame how you might actually approach a conversation with your students about this. Okay. So here's a bit of a worked example that I've put together that you're more than welcome to take and adapt. Again, I don't think that, this is going to be absolutely perfect for everybody, but it gives you a bit of a sort of idea about how you might go about delivering a task or an activity with your students. So the idea is that students, and this is actually quite similar to what Callie was suggesting a little bit earlier and what some of you have been posting in the chat. So again, there's nothing original here, and it's quite a simple approach. Basically, again, the idea is that students are on their own or with a peer unpacking the task and the rubric well in advance of the assessment. So again, positioning it as a formative tool. First, they're reading and annotating the task and the rubric, highlighting what they're being asked to demonstrate, the purpose and the key concepts. Next, you might like to ask them to explain the task back in their own words. So a prompt that you could use is finish the sentence, "This assessment is asking me to." And basically, this is a really good approach for helping you to quickly and early identify misconceptions or misunderstandings and address them well before the assessment itself. Finally, our students identify what they need to demonstrate, what concepts and skills, how they'll show them, and what quality looks like. Once they've had a go at working it out themselves, you can bring them and the group back together and talk it through, comparing what they came up with, clearing up anything they've misread, and drawing out anything they might have missed. So again, I keep bringing up the literature, but it's really interesting because the literature is quite consistent across this, which I kind of appreciated, because how often do you read some educational literature where there's, everyone seems fairly united. And the literature really does point to the value of this dialogic approach on student understanding. And as we saw in those earlier papers that we were having a look at, the students really value it too. So it's simple, but this approach provides some structure around the decoding and interpretation process. On the right, you'll see some tips for running it. So you might consider using a Padlet wall for some parts of this activity. We've been sort of spruiking Padlet as a really great approach for allowing students to post questions anonymously, which ensures that anyone who might be shy or feel a little bit uncomfortable asking questions publicly can feel a little bit more confident in participating. And again, you can post dummy questions or, sort of dummy interpretations to kind of help students feel more confident because they're not dealing with that blank space. And it also allows you to potentially anticipate questions that might be asked and pop them up there yourself. You might also take a moment to unpack the rubric terminology deliberately. So basically taking the verb, the content and the context. And I've just posted a really sort of basic example of what that might look like. So you've got 2 verbs here. You've got the content, what the response needs to be about. You've got the link, so what you did shaped what happened, and then the context. So in this case, it's an article that the student has written, not a general sort of preparation, but the actual interview itself that they've done for this particular journalism assignment. Or as we discussed in the previous slide, you can use Bloom's or another framework like Solo to pull the criterion and standards apart. Where you can, using exemplars to help your students see the different standards of performance and what they actually look like is probably the highest value approach that you're going to find. So the research around exemplars and their role in supporting students to understand different standards and examples of quality notes that it's important to avoid using a perfect exemplar. So if you are going to use an exemplar, try and use a good but not perfect exemplar. That really gives your students something to really dig into. It allows them to critique, to provide suggestions for improvement, and to start to use their own evaluative judgment to determine what standards the exemplar is currently meeting and what would lift it, for example, from a C to a D to a HD. Again, I did mention at the start that the one thing I hope you take away today is the need to explicitly teach students how to understand, use and decode rubrics. If I can be a little bit greedy and ask you to take 2 things away, it would be that exemplars, while an incredibly powerful tool, are not on their own enough. They need to be interpreted, talked through, so students can take the insights and apply it to their own task. And again, the literature is really clear on the dialogic value of this approach. Unfortunately, the literature does suggest that just providing students with an exemplar isn't necessarily enough to really push the learning in the direction that we're hoping it to be pushed. There is a need for that supported dialogue and discourse around what is going on in the exemplar, what is working and why it's working, what might be a space where there might be some improvement that could kind of push it towards another grade band. But again, that dialogic piece is absolutely critical. I'm just going to check the chat again. Sorry. Yep, exemplar doesn't stipulate a complete answer. Sorry, I'm scrolling back up. A task on a task. Just one more. Mine was about the site, not the. Sorry. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Callie. Yeah, I really like Solo, and I think it's a good little taxonomy tool as well that can help our students. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Solo today, but it just felt like a little bit too much for a session, for today's session. But in your own time, I would really encourage you to just have a bit of a dive into Solo and have a think about whether or not it might be something that you could work with your students. Because yeah, it's a really nice framework, and I think it's probably a little bit more student facing than Bloom's, but again, it is one of those taxonomies that you're going to have to spend the time to walk your students through it, help them to understand what each sort of level of the taxonomy is referring to and asking for, or yeah, it's going to take a little bit of work. Future PD workshop on taxonomies. I don't know how much interest there'd be in that, Lachlan. Do you think people would want to sort of sit there for an hour and talk taxonomies? Maybe they would.
Might be a few people telling us that they're going to watch the recordings perhaps, but I feel like there would at least be some in that space.
I think one of the really interesting things about like taxonomies like Bloom's and Solo is that there is a lot of like different sort of perspectives on their value and on their application. I always love to get into those kind of nitty gritty sort of theoretical discussions about how the taxonomy is, you know, sort of effective in some contexts, potentially not in others, or just kind of looking at yeah, how all the pieces kind of come together to sort of support the learning process. Okay, so I put this little slide together. It's just to provide you with a bit of an idea about how you might go about actually delivering an exemplar activity to support your students. So the key points here for using an exemplar to support students to decode expectations for their assessment. Within a supervised assessment, we're probably going to need some sort of recording. It's very difficult to get a couple of people in there and kind of recreate a mock supervised assessment. So taking the time to plan and to sort of prepare with the recording is a really helpful approach. Again, we're not looking for a perfect example, but something that gives our students the opportunity to exercise their evaluative judgment muscles. So we can ask our students after we've shown them the exemplar to mark the exemplar against the rubric themselves. And you could get them to do that independently with a peer in a small group. After they've had a go, you bring them back and talk it through together. So again, that dialogic piece that's so critical. Comparing your judgments, working out what separates one standard from the next, and really ensuring that students understand exactly what the criterion is asking for and how that is being I guess, manifested within the supervised assessment task itself, exemplar. The added bonus here is that watching a real example doesn't just help our students to understand the standards, it lets them see the format in action and get a feel for what to expect on the day. So in that previous preparing activities and supports for students, we really talked about helping students to feel confident, to help them feel like they understand what is being expected of them within the context of the format of the supervised assessment as well. So this actually kind of, I think, kills two birds with one stone. You're getting that chance to sort of build that evaluative judgment while also helping students to feel more confident and to have a better understanding about what to expect. We know that students can feel a little bit stressed or a little bit of anxiousness in the lead up to supervised assessment, and that a lot of this does come from the unknown of the format itself. So these exemplars can really help to build that student confidence. If you're looking for some help getting started designing an exemplar, you will find some examples available via the Teaching Academy. There's a couple of really good little interactive oral assessment example exemplars up there that you could potentially use. That being said, it probably is ideal if you can have an exemplar that actually shows your assessment. So I would probably recommend using the ones on the Teaching Academy as a bit of an inspiration, a bit of guidance as to how you might go about designing these. And I just wanted to check with our educational designers, is this an area that you could offer support as well, like support sort of designing an approach to an exemplar? Yep. Yep.
I've
Great.
popped that link in the chat there too, Elise, that you've got in your
Thank you
slides.
so much. Let's open that one up just so that everyone can kind of see what we've got going on here. I know. I think I've got one day to reset it because I like to live on the edge. If this does a duo thing, I'm going to be really annoyed. No duo. Yeah, so this is within the Teaching Academy Brightspace site. My internet says no. So this is great. I love this as well. This isn't an exemplar, but this is really that introduction to IOA. So if that is a particular form of supervised assessment that you're using with your students, why not screen this before you start having that discussion about expectations and diving into the rubric? So again, you can really demystify what is actually being asked for, why we're using them. It's a great little piece of content. And then we have down here some guidance as well about how you might go about showcasing what an interactive oral assessment looks like. But I think you can take the broad principles that are shared on this page and adapt them to any supervised assessment to design an exemplar. Down here, we've got an example from JST 220 where the subject coordinator is playing the role of a student and a peer plays the role of the assessor. We've got another example. This one's from Griffith University. And I think what I like about these as well is that, again, they're not perfect and they do show the student having moments of struggle and working through them, being supported by their marker as well to kind of navigate through those sort of, I guess, assessment moments. There's also some great little resources here. And again, some recommended practice activities. So these are kind of similar to what we've looked at today. The sample marking activity, brainstorm scenario brainstorming, sorry, and peer assessment using alternative scenarios. Is it unscented? I think it's because it's in the H5P or actually Brightspace module. Okie dokie, let's jump back in. So yeah, I'd just sort of love to hear, have you used or designed a supervised assessment exemplar? And what was your experience using it? Again, we've got a lot of educational designers in the room today, so I'd love to hear any tips that you might have for potentially designing an exemplar or walking your students through the activity that might come out of that exemplar itself.
I'd love to hop in here, Elise, but I have nothing.
Please.
Surely that may be one of my colleagues.
I'm sort of in the same boat. I just don't have much to contribute, but I do know of a couple of EDs that have, I don't think they're in this room, but for what I know, Amita is amazing at that job, and she has done many before. So yeah, I'm sure if only she was here, she'd be able to give us a little bit, but yeah, sorry. Yeah, there just isn't.
No, that's completely understandable. And yeah, Amita is wonderful. I've seen some of the work she's done around the IOA exemplars, and obviously she's sort of been in that space quite heavily for a long time. So she's a really great resource to draw upon if you are looking for support. Absolute wealth of experience and knowledge. Right, cool. Thanks, everyone. So again, I think the point that we're really trying to make here is just the criticality of that dialogue with your students, of having that conversation, having that discussion, giving them the opportunity to make mistakes and have those, I guess, rectified by the teacher, helping to dispel misconceptions, and just really supporting them to actually see what it is that we're looking for. I did have a look at the literature on the value of exemplars, particularly when they're delivered with dialogue. And there is a lot of literature that really supports this approach. So you might like to have a look at some of these papers. in particular, I think that Colvin paper is really, really great. And I like this Handley and Williams paper as well. It's a nice one. All right. So just a couple of reminders from the literature that probably just reinforce what we've kind of been talking about today. Rubrics are written by experts and read by novices. What is transparent for an expert may be opaque to the student. Needing support to understand a rubric is part of the learning process, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your rubric is not well designed and that it's not hitting the marks that it's supposed to be hitting. So we did talk earlier about potentially having a look and reviewing your rubric and seeing if there's sort of potential for improvement or redesign. That may not always be the case though. Sometimes it is simply that we need to be getting involved in that sort of explicit learning and really walking our students through the steps and the construction of the rubric and what it means. And it's also not a failing of the student. And I think we've really sort of talked about that earlier in the session. Lachlan.
I was just going to say, although she's no longer at the uni, Kim Bailey was quite sort of famous with her students, her law students, for an approach that she took with assessment sort of more generally. Part of her weekly tutorials, the time allocation in those, that they would spend half an hour in that tutorial sort of engaging with different parts of the assessment tasks week to week. And that was something that the students knew up front. And a part of that was dedicated to looking at different parts of the rubric, for example, the scales. They'd take extracts from different sort of submissions in the past, etc., and scrutinising those and unpacking, again, what we're talking about here. So what the rubric's asking for, what the student provided, and why those two kind of lined up. So it became, I mean, obviously the recordings were things that people engaged with closer to the assessment task itself, but it was a synchronous opportunity in the first instance for students to kind of do that troubleshooting and unpacking that, and actually have the academic on hand there to help sort of decode some of that. And then the recording itself then became kind of a value add. So it really became quite sort of a hallmark of her approach to dealing with sort of assessment and delivery in that same kind of space.
That's fantastic. I love that. And particularly because you're kind of embedding it within each tutorial or lecture. Again, you've kind of got that sequencing going. Students are sort of following that narrative. They know that they're going to get that additional support and scaffolding as well. So it's just kind of building it in as part of the cadence of the learning, rather than, as you said, you know, something that's bolted on, I guess, occasionally, where we find the time and you know, when we feel like we can actually dedicate it to the students. Liz, I really love that point. And I've actually been reflecting on this myself. It would be so great to revisit some of the supervised assessment practice at the end of the session and really pull together a bit of a showcase of some of the things that our academics have been doing that have been really working well for them, whether that's in the preparation for supervised assessment, whether that's in helping students to decode expectations, understand rubrics, whether it's designing exemplars, whether it's designing other activities and approaches, or whether it's delivering the supervised assessment itself, and some of those strategies to support our students and to ensure that they've got the best opportunity to really showcase what they know in a supportive and I guess environment that really facilitates their ability to do that. So I think we definitely will need to have a think about how we might pull something like that together, because I think it would be just wonderful. Love a showcase. And of course, Sadler, would it be a conversation about assessment in higher education without a bit of Sadler? Bringing students into a knowledge of standards requires considerably more than sending them one-way messages through rubrics, written feedback, or other forms of telling. It requires use of the same tools as those employed for setting, conveying, and sharing standards among teachers: exemplars, explanations, conversation, and tacit knowing. So yeah, I think this slide really sums up the crux of what we're trying to kind of get at today. Again, I don't think you need to jump back into the back into Menti, because again, we're a small group. But I was just hoping that we might have a quick chat about if there's anything here that you think might be effective to try with students, or if there's something that we haven't talked about today that I might have missed, that you think would be worth highlighting for anyone who is potentially listening back to the conversation through the recording, or who's here today. We are a small group, and I do really appreciate how engaged you've been today. So I won't put anyone on the spot. We are coming to the end of the session, but yeah, maybe just, I guess, an opportunity to have a bit of a reflect on anything from today that we might take forward, or for the educational designers, approaches that might work in your practice supporting academics and markers.
Elise, I can't remember the slide number, but that one that you had with the table, I think that could be a useful tool for academics to use with students, because I think it does sort of describe some of those descriptors, if I can put it that way. It's nice to have that in a table form so students can look at that and help demystify a rubric themselves.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if it might be kind of useful as well, rather than presenting them with the whole table, which is obviously going to be potentially overwhelming, just to kind of identify those particular verbs that are actually present in the criterion and standards, so that you can really hone that approach and ensure that students kind of getting the information that will be most valuable.
Yeah, good point.
Lachlan says, I'd humbly suggest the beginning of next session, as opposed to getting academics in at week 14. You need a trauma crew at that point. Yep, that's a good point. Absolutely. Great. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Again, I think we've got mostly EDs in the room, but for anyone watching the recording back, if you are looking for support, our educational designers, as I've mentioned, are absolutely wonderful. They promote evidence-based teaching practice and support the professional learning of academic staff in learning and teaching to enhance the student experience and promote excellence, and they do it very, very well. Mark's just popped the link in the chat. And so, yeah, if you need to book any support with our ED team, you can absolutely do so via the Sherwell through the link here on the slide, or the one that Mark has just shared in the chat. All right, so that's about all I've got for you guys today. Thank you again to everyone who has contributed. It's been so wonderful to, I think these sessions work so much better when we're having that conversation. Nobody just wants to sit here and sort of watch content be presented, and it really does depend on you being willing to engage. So thank you so much. It makes these sessions, I think, a lot more enjoyable for everyone involved. And I hope that you found some useful approaches here today, or at least started to sort of have a think about how we might have some of these conversations with our students about our rubrics, about what's expected in a supervised assessment, and of course as well looking at the assessment brief itself. I can see we've got some comments coming through, so we'll just wait. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks so much, Callie. Thanks, Liz and Hayley. Thanks to everyone. Thanks, Lachlan. All right, everyone. I'll give you back 5 minutes in your calendar. Thank you again for joining us today. And look forward to hopefully working with you through the Teaching Academy again.